Hello and welcome back to the GCP-Mindset channel. Today we'll talk about trial design decisions that save time and money.
Our first question is, how does biostatistics influence the decision between an adaptive design and a traditional randomized study design?
Whether to use an adaptive design or go with a more classical approach to your clinical trial really often depends on the level of certainty you have with the assumptions as you're going in. You already know which dose to use, whether to use a comparator arm or not. You already know exactly the type of assumptions that move into your sample size calculation. You can most likely pull through with a normal classical trial design that doesn't have adaptive features. And the more uncertainty you have, the more powerful is the utilization of these adaptive designs. They come with a drawback, however, because it's not so easy to always interpret the outcome. And sometimes that requires more discussions with regulators up front. So if you're quite certain, then go ahead and choose a more well-known, robust clinical trial design that is not adaptive. If, however, there are uncertainties, then statistically there are many ways you can handle them. You can run a pilot project to reduce these uncertainties and then still go with a classical design, or you can be more fluid in those approaches, and that's when you leverage adaptive trial designs. And that goes from adding or removing arms, recalculating the sample sizes, or even switching endpoints. You need to predefine certain conditions that have to be met for you to change your trial, adding arms, removing arms, for example. But as long as you define these considerations beforehand, put in the effort, then an adaptive design can really pay off. So I would always approach it from a point of reflecting first what information you have and how robust they are. And then you think about which trial design to implement.
Are there real examples where a well-executed sample size reassessment prevented a study from being under or overpowered?
I have very fond memories of my very first clinical trial that I ran as the responsible statistician. It was for a medical device, and we ran an adaptive trial design. It was a two-stage design, so this is a really simple adaptive trial design where you accrue a certain number of participants, then you check the primary endpoint first, and we could already at that point stop for performance of the device or recruit the second half of the trial and then complete it at the end of all of it. Now, the sponsor coming in was very convinced that they had great performance of the device. And for that reason, we suggested at the time that we could leverage this two-stage design to have the potential of reducing the sample size, and by that also then the trial duration. So interim analysis was performed, and we ended up only needing just under half of the patients that we had originally envisioned. And we saved around a year of trial recruitment that we still would have needed to go all the way to the initially designed sample size. So for the client, that meant faster market access, faster primary endpoint data, which they could use to start their marketing, and of course, a lot of saved money. So this was a great example of where an interim analysis and adaptive design led to a reduction in sample size and gave an opportunity for the client to start through. It did not come without risks, because we needed to stop the enrollment for the interim analysis for ethical reasons, which meant that had we not succeeded in stopping the trial earlier, the interim analysis, the trial overall would have taken longer. So it's a trade-off where you really need to be sure that you can leverage it, or you need to be fine with losing potentially a bit of time and at the end of the day adding a few patients in case you do not meet the criteria at the interim analysis. Now, conversely, we've also had a case where we did an interim analysis and we reflected upon recently novel publication data from a meta-analysis that indicated to us that our anticipated effect size that we used for the sample size calculation of the trial was probably not correct, but rather the effect should be smaller than what we anticipated. What does that mean? If we had gone through with the entire trial, which was not planned to be adaptive in the beginning, we would not have had enough power to really have a good indication of whether there is an effect or not. Since this was not a confirmatory trial with which we wanted to go to the market, we decided it's best to reassess the sample size, increasing it, because this would allow us to have more robust outcomes that give us a better idea of whether we are moving in the right direction or not. And this was a result of reflecting novel information that was published and was unknown at the beginning of the trial, and then using flexibility and moving forward with the trial in a way that ensures we have more reliable information at the end of it all. Now, this was not planned as an adaptive trial, so we adjusted it in between. These are always difficult decisions to make because they impact trial integrity. However, it is much better to reflect on your ongoing trials and whether there is still a positive benefit-risk ratio, and the benefit depends on having reliable information at the end of the trial, and then try your way forward in adapting the processes after.
How are real-world data sources, for example, patient registries, integrated into initial sample size calculations in modern trials?
So we've seen a rise of availability of real-world evidence data over the last years because it's been getting more and more accepted as supporting evidence for regulatory submissions by regulators all over the globe. And we've also recognized that it's a great source for real-world information driving the development, but also the validation of safety and efficacy of our medicinal products and medical devices. So with more data being more abundant, of course, the question arises, can't we leverage this more also in sample size calculation? And the answer is absolutely. Now, there's a few caveats here. First of all, you need to have access to the real-world evidence. Unless it's your own registry or your own data from prior trials, you might not have access to the information. There are some public clusters which allow you to send a research question to them, for them to give you an answer and an overview which could help guide your sample size calculation. And you could make use of those to test the robustness of your assumptions in terms of effect size, variability, or even the doses that you are trying to attempt to use in your trials. So the second point to consider is how comparable the real-world evidence is to your study and your study design. The caveat with real-world evidence is that it's collected and it's representative of conditions you will find in day-to-day life, which are not heavily controlled and can have a lot of confounding variables. So, as you take real-world evidence to inform your sample size calculation, you must acknowledge and account for the differences you will encounter to a strictly controlled trial population which you would enroll in, for example, early phase clinical trials. So, don't just blindly trust the information you will find in real-world evidence as representative for the population you're going to study, but rather reflect on where there are differences. As far as possible, try to identify maybe a subgroup within your real-world evidence that is best matching with the target population that you are seeking to enroll, and then leverage that and combine it with other sources of information like publications or prior trials that you have run to really come to a conclusion of what would best work for your sample size calculation. So, in short, real-world evidence can assist in finding better estimators for your sample size calculation, but you have to be careful, and of course, access to this information is a first key element in integrating it.
Thanks for watching, and see you next time on the GCP Mindset channel.